Hello everybody, welcome to our August Training Tuesday event for OU Campus. Today's topic is all about includes. We're going to cover include files and how to use them in OU Campus. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode as this session is being recorded. If you have a question during the presentation, you may submit it online by clicking on the Q&A tab located on the right-hand side of your screen. Make sure it's the Q&A tab and not chat, so we have your email address in case your question warrants a follow-up reply. Simply type your question into the dialog box at the bottom of the screen and send. If you do use chat, address your question to the presenter, not the host, so he can see it. We will attempt to address your questions during the presentation. After the formal presentation has ended, we will review and answer all remaining questions. Your presenter today is Brandon Scheirman, software trainer at OmniUpdate. Brandon, I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Erica. Appreciate it. Welcome, everybody, to today's Training Tuesday. Looking forward to a good session today talking about includes. I feel like at this point it's basically tradition for me to throw in at least a couple awful jokes during these Training Tuesdays, so I'll get one out of the way right now. Typically we've got something like, you've got pork, the other white meat. Well, we've got includes, the other type of reusable content. That's kind of what we got going on today. Of course, I'm sure that many of you, if not all of you, are extremely familiar with the assets and snippets within OU Campus. Those are kind of the two main reusable content types that we talk about. Well, includes are another type of reusable content. This one is not unique to OU Campus, but we definitely leverage it because it's a pretty standard web technology, I guess. So I just want to kind of dive into it today so you can brush up a little bit on the basics for what it is overall and also how we are using it inside of your CMS. So our agenda is going to be just the basics first of all. What are includes in the first place? How do they get used? How do we actually utilize them on a web page? And then, of course, we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between an asset and an include, because as we get through this, we might kind of understand they're actually pretty similar to one another. So what are the differences and when should you use one over the other? And then most of our time is going to be spent seeing includes in action today. So we'll spend most of our time, like usual, as a live demonstration. So here's the basics about an include file. Includes, kind of like assets, are a way to make sure that your universal content isn't repeated in the source code of every file. For those developers out there, the dreaded spaghetti code is a big issue. You don't necessarily want to have just like one large document that's a billion lines long that contains all of your information. You can separate out some of the information that's being utilized on multiple pages and have just a single origin source for that file as opposed to having to repeat it on every page. So a great example, every page is going to have a header and you're going to want to make sure that you're not just writing the code for every single page to include all of the code for the header. If it's utilized universally, you might as well just have a single source for it. So basically the way that we do that is we separate it into its own file and then you put a little reference on each page that goes and grabs that source data. So if we take a normal page as an example, my header, my footer, those are going to be universal. Every page is going to have it, and the content in it is going to be the exact same. We also have other potential examples, such as this navigation area. Not every page is going to have this navigation area, but at least all of the files within my athletics section should be referencing that same navigation area. So with these things in mind, these are kind of some of the common use cases for when you would want to have some sort of include. So let's dive a little bit deeper into the structure of what an include actually is. So first of all, include files can be anything you want them to be. Pretty much the web servers just treat them as text. So it can contain any sort of data, and they can also be referenced actually by any file extension either, which we'll see in the demo later on today. So the thing that mostly differentiates includes from anything else that we talk about when it comes to reusable content is the fact that includes are added to your web page on the server side, which means the production server itself is actually what's grabbing that origin content and putting it onto the page. And that goes in contrast with OU Campus and assets, whereas assets are actually added to the page on the staging server before there's ever any sort of publishing or before the production server comes into play. So that's kind of the main difference there. Includes are added on the server side, which is why you'll hear it called a server-side include or an SSI. So if you look online and you see some more resources that talk about SSIs or server-side includes, that's what we're talking about today. So back in, a little bit of a history lesson, I suppose, back in the days of, before server-side scripting was very common, you could perform a server-side include on just a flat HTML page, and by doing so, you would actually rename that file extension. Instead of HTML, you would rename it SHTML, which stood for server-side HTML. Basically, what that did is it told the web server that it should follow or abide by or execute any sort of server-side inclusions that are happening on that page. A normal .html file wouldn't necessarily know to do so, but an SHTML file would contain the instructions to do that. So that was kind of the basics, I guess, the default behavior there. So files that have that extension could parse those server-side include commands by default. However, not everybody wanted to have files that ended with .shtml. So what you can do in those situations is you can modify some settings on your web server to allow other extensions to parse those server-side includes. So, in a sample example, we have a very simple htaccess file right here, and basically this little add handler server-parsed.shtml, that's the instruction there that essentially tells the system, hey, this is what you're able to do, parse these server-side includes with an SHTML extension, if that page has an SHTML extension. If I wanted, for example, just normal HTML files to execute server-side includes, I would just add another line in here that would add in .html as one of my server parsed commands there. So that's kind of the basics for what it was, back in the day. Now, moving into how we actually use those on an actual page, we'll kind of continue with our history lesson and say if you were not running any server-side scripting, so like no PHP, no C#, whatever, and you were in like an Apache environment, you would essentially have something like this. So you would put a comment in your HTML file, and it would be comment tag, include virtual, and then you'd provide the path to that include file. And essentially what that would tell the system is as soon as the parser runs into that line of code, instead of just outputting that as a comment, go to that path and fetch whatever content is there and just plop it right in. And since this file was just going to be treated as text, whatever you had put in that file was just going to be directly translated over. Now, if you were in an IIS environment, it would look a little bit different. It would still be a comment, but instead of virtual, you would have file there, and you would have to provide the full path from your drive all the way to the include file. So it would start with whatever drive that your files were located on and just go all the way to where that source file was located. However, that's a little bit more of an antiquated method of doing things because nowadays most people have web servers that are running server-side scripting languages and things like that. So when you're talking about server-side scripting languages, they can also perform these server-side includes. So for example, if you're in PHP and you have a web server that runs that language, things are going to look a little bit different. Instead of having this little comment for including, the include virtual or the virtual include, it's going to look something like this. So it's going to actually be a little line of PHP that you put into your HTML document, and it's going to be PHP include, and then, it's just a function within PHP, so you'd provide, where that include file is, and then close it like any other PHP script tag. So that's kind of the basic format for how it would look. If you wanted to have your pathing be root relative to just from the kind of the beginning of the web root moving onwards, if you're grabbing include files from other directories or whatnot, whatever's inside of the include function will look a little bit more complex. It's going to look something like this. So you'll still do the PHP include, and then you're going to just write, your _server document root, and that's basically just going to tell PHP to go all the way from the drive up to the web root, and then from there on out, you can just concatenate where the path itself is. So you just would still provide the root relative path to your include afterwards, and then close the function like you normally would. You've got that going on. That's how you would do it if you were in a PHP environment. If you're running .NET languages like C# or ASP.NET, it's actually going to look basically the same as one of your command or your comment style methods that we saw up above. So depending on the server environment, you can still run .NET on an Apache environment. You would do a virtual include in that case, or probably more commonly, you would use the IIS method, which would be including the file and then providing the full path. So that's pretty much how it would work. This is the actual text that you would put in your HTML document to allow the server to actually grab your include file and display it. So kind of going back to our previous slide, we're still going to have to tell the web server to execute these scripts on HTML documents. So there's still going to be some sort of modification to your htaccess file or your web.config in order to actually let your HTML documents execute PHP. Normally, PHP scripts are only going to be run on a file that has the .php extension. Most web pages, you might not have it running the .php extension. You might still just be displaying .html. So you would need to modify your htaccess file in order to allow PHP to be executed on HTML files. And once that's done, that's when your PHP includes could actually work. So when it comes to modifying your htaccess or your web.config files, there are plenty of online resources. Obviously, every server is a little bit different in terms of its environment. So if you haven't been using server-side includes with your server-side languages and you're interested in it, there are a lot of resources that you can find on your own, or if you want to be kind of guided to that, potentially our support team could direct you towards some good resources to show you how to do that there. But I would probably guess that most of you are probably already doing this, you just might not necessarily have known. So that's kind of the basics for how we're actually going to be using our include files and what it's going to look like on an individual page. Now let's talk a little bit about assets and includes. So at this point, we've talked about reusing content and grabbing it and putting it on pages and wanting to make sure that that same content is repeated on multiple pages, and that sounds a lot like what assets do. So assets in OU Campus are really similar to includes because they both give you content reuse, and the pages are both going to get that updated content automatically when the included file is updated. So, you modify an asset, you publish out the asset, the pages that have that asset placed on it are going to get your new data. Same thing with an include file. You update the include file and you publish it, all of a sudden all the pages that are grabbing that include data are, going to have that new data. So they're very similar in that regard. The main difference between assets and includes is when that inclusion happens. So with an asset, we're including this information on the staging server. So we place the asset in an editable region, for example, and you'll see that it will render inside of OU Campus, and it's going to be placed in the page before the XSL transformation happens, and therefore before the publish happens. Whereas includes are being brought in on the production server side of things. So from the staging server's perspective, nothing happens, pretty much. It's after the XSL transformation has happened, after the publish has happened, and then the web server on the other side of things is going to be actually grabbing that data and placing it on your page. So that's kind of the main difference. And then there's also another slight difference when it comes to how the included file updates. So for an asset, as an example, when you update and publish that asset, it's actually going to trigger a republish of the page in OU Campus because, of course, the publishing is what actually is giving us our new information on the live site. And so because if the asset gets updated, you have to have the pages published in order to get that new data. So that's kind of one thing that happens with assets. A quick little note, when you update an asset and it causes a republish to occur, one thing that some of you all might not know, it kind of flies under the radar a bit, but it uses a system in OU Campus called the last published version. So it just essentially publishes out the exact same content that's already live, but it just kind of causes it to refetch the asset data and doesn't touch anything else. So if you were like working on a page and you had saved some content to the staging server, but you weren't ready to publish out that content yet, and someone updates an asset that was used on the same page, that new content that you weren't ready to make live yet, luckily it won't actually go live. So that's what the benefit of the last published version is. So just a quick little note there. But at the end of the day, what I'm really trying to say is that the asset will trigger a republish in OU Campus. But when you're updating and publishing an include, of course, there's no need for a republish because the web server, the production server, is doing that inclusion after the publish has already occurred. So there's no publishing besides the include file that happens when you're doing it with includes as opposed to assets. So those are kind of the main differences. Now, that kind of brings up the question of when am I supposed to use one or the other, right? So from what I can kind of, from my experience, assets are typically preferred for kind of ad hoc on-demand inclusion. So it might not be that every page on my website needs this particular content. Maybe it's only 2 or 3, and those 2 or 3 pages are strewn throughout my entire site. So in the example of when not every page in your site or not every page in a particular section needs this reusable content, that's probably a good reason to make it as an asset because you can place an asset on whatever pages you want, wherever on the page you want too. If you wanted to place some reusable content into an existing editable region, that's another way that assets are beneficial because obviously we have a UI and an item in our WYSIWYG toolbar that allows for that to happen more easily. So assets are preferable in that situation too. And then also, if there's a situation where you needed XSL to act upon some of that included content, so for example, a form asset or an image gallery where the raw XML that the asset actually creates is not what you want to be the final output, and you need XSL to kind of bridge the gap, so to speak, that's another situation where you would want to use an asset because since the asset's being included before the XSL process happens, XSL can kind of manipulate the data that's contained within the asset, whereas XSL can't manipulate the data that's contained within an include file. So the include file needs to be the exact final form that you want, effectively. So that's kind of the situations where assets are preferable. Includes are better for truly universal content or more source codey uses. I'll put that in air quotes, I guess. So a great example, every page in my site is going to use this header. Well, you really don't need to have that be an asset. You can just make that an include file and kind of bring that in from the source code perspective because it's not like people are going to need to use that asset anywhere else. I need to bring content into my head tag or something that's not going to be visually presentable on the page itself. That's another situation that's more of a source codey use where an include file would work fine. Another situation that I've kind of alluded to is I want to guarantee that this content appears in the same place on every page and can't be used elsewhere. Obviously, if I made my header, going back to that example, if I made my header an asset, of course I could place that header asset where it's supposed to be for the header, but hypothetically, maybe it also, someone is in an editable region and they're just browsing throughout the asset manager and they see header, oh, this looks kind of interesting, and they try to place it in an editable region. It's probably not going to work. So that's another situation where an include file could be preferable because, it kind of removes it from the end user's perspective a little bit more so than assets do. And one other example is I don't want updates to my universal content to trigger or republish in OU Campus. You could use an include instead. This really probably isn't that big of an issue. Like I said, the last published version that assets do when they do the republish, it's very safe, so you're not really going to worry about any new content getting prematurely pushed out. But, for example, if you have, an asset as a header and updating that asset would cause every page in your site to publish, that might be something where you wouldn't want to necessarily do that. One other thing, I guess, specifically that includes are really good at, not so much as a distinction between assets and includes, but you might be kind of thinking that, well, why do I need to use includes when I could just hard code some of this information, some of this universal information into the XSL itself. You could do that, but the main benefit that includes have over hard coding stuff into your XSL is that hard coding something into the XSL requires a site publish for that new information to actually get pushed out to the live server, whereas an include obviously doesn't need to do that. So it kind of relates to the updates to trigger or republish in OU Campus, but not because it's different than assets, just as an alternative to hard coding things into XSL, which would be another way to get universal content on every page, for example. So with this in mind, those are kind of our key differences and similarities. Let's go ahead and launch into OU Campus real quick and see a couple practical examples of includes working their magic. So what I've got here is I've just got OU Campus pulled up. Just as a quick little FYI, here's what my normal pages look like. I'm just using kind of our standard Galena University test environment here. Some context before we launch into this, the site is in an Apache environment, and it is running PHP as its server-side scripting language on the web server. So basically this environment has already been set up for me to parse my include files. So I don't need to go into htaccess or anything at this point to do any of that stuff. And I would say for probably most of you, since many of you are existing customers, if not all of you, it's probably likely that your web server has also been set up appropriately to do this already. So this might not, those sorts of steps might not be something that y'all need to worry about. If that is the case, like I said, we're always able to, point you guys in the right direction for learning how to do some of this, and also your IT team at your institution, your hosting provider for your production server, all of those people are good resources as well. So with that context in mind, let's actually go over to this little include test page that I have. Basically, it's just a very simple, flat HTML page because I want to show you very briefly how includes are working on just a normal page. This would be how includes would work even if you weren't using OU Campus. You could, FTP this information to just a web server somewhere and play around with this on just a flat HTML file on your own if you want to. It doesn't require OU Campus to work. So looking in the source of this flat HTML file, we can look and see that it's just a pretty standard HTML document. We've got our HTML tag, head tag, body tag, etc. Let me just go ahead and zoom this in a little bit for you all watching at home, so to speak. And you can see that I've just got, some standard editable regions. But you'll notice that I've got specific code here for example, my header. And I've also, down here, I've got a footer, for example, and then even more so, I've even got some scripts that are loading at the bottom of my body tag. I've got some various scripts or potentially scripts that are loading inside of my head code. Some of this stuff we can already identify is universal content, globally available. Every page that looks like this will probably have the same header. So what we could do is let's go ahead and actually separate out this universal content into include files, because right now no includes are being utilized on this page. So what I'm first going to go ahead and do is I'm just going to cut out my header. So my header is now gone. You can see that I no longer have a big blue hello world up at the top, and we're just right up here at the content. So what I want to do is I want to separate that file out into its own separate little include, and that way, if I have 10 of these pages, I don't need to have the code for the header repeated on every single document. Now they can all just pull from the same source. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is just inside of the same section here for in the ease of the example, I'm just going to go ahead and make a new blank file, and I'm going to go ahead and call it header. One thing that's really cool about include files, the file extension for the include itself doesn't actually matter. So in OU Campus, we typically call it the .inc extension, just because the .inc stands for include, and it can just kind of indicate more easily to you guys that this is information that's just being included. It's not meant to be a standalone page. So that's what we use, but many other people will just have it be include, or HTML or even SHTML to indicate that it's meant to be included on the server side. Some people will even actually call it .ssi to stand for a server-side include. You can pretty much call this whatever you want. I'll keep it at .inc for right now, but we'll see later that it truly does not matter. So first of all, I'm just going to create this header.inc file. And if I go into the source code of this view, you can see that it is literally an empty file right now. So I'm just going to go ahead in here, and I'm going to just paste that content that I had cut from my original page. And then I'm going to go ahead and save that and publish it out. So the reason why I published this is because all of the inclusion stuff will be happening on the production server. Of course, there needs to be a copy of this file on the production server for the production server to actually grab. So it's not able to reach back into the depths of the staging server and grab this information. It's going to look at the staging, or it's going to look on the production server for my included files. So just as an FYI, all of your includes do need to be published, otherwise they're not going to do anything. Another quick note, you'll notice that when I'm looking at the header include file itself, it does not give me any of that CSS styling that we saw before. All we get is just the basic styling and the text itself. The reason for that is because, this include file doesn't contain any CSS information. This is not really meant to be, looked at by itself. Just a single div without any sort of other context, that's not going to give us anything. So now we have our include file, and we've called it header.inc. So what now we need to do, now that we've separated this out, all we need to do is go back into my original file here, and where there once was actual header content, we're going to go ahead and reference an include. So I already said that we're using PHP on this production environment. Before we do that, I'm just going to kind of type out what it would look like if I were not using PHP or if I were in an IIS environment. I can't actually show you it working functionally, but I can at least type it out for you. So what we would do is just right underneath that header comment, just for some context there, I'll make my comment tag. And actually, let me change the theme. That comment tag is really hard to see relative to the background. This might be a little bit better for y'all. Hopefully it is. So what I'll do first is I'm going to do my hash mark, include, virtual, and then after virtual, just equal sign and some quotes. And then I get to provide the path for this file. And this is a root relative path. So we'll just start off with a slash, and I'll just go ahead and say training-section, because that's the folder that we're in right here. And then I would just put in where that file is located. And if we remember, we called that header.inc. Once that's done, I just need to finish out my comment tag. And at this point, I would basically be able to hit save and publish it out. And if this were an IIS environment, or I mean not an IIS environment, if this were an environment that wasn't running PHP and potentially might be running, C# or something like that, and I was in Apache, for example, that's pretty much what we got going on there. So if I were to look at this, it would, normally show, but like I said, we're in the different environment, so we won't actually see anything work. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to show you the PHP way to do it so we can actually see the fruits of our labor. So the PHP doesn't use comments, so we can actually just get rid of that. And we'll start off by just writing some PHP in our HTML file. And like I said, I've already set up my htaccess file, so PHP can actually execute on HTML documents. So that's already set up, which is why this is working so effortlessly. So we do PHP, and we're just going to go ahead and say include, and then we're going to give us some comments here, and then we're going to do $_server. And the $_server, if you're not familiar, is kind of like a variable that is stored within PHP, and then actually I think it grabs an array, and then whatever you put in the brackets here will kind of show what part of the array that you're grabbing from. So basically server, and then I can put in quotes here inside the brackets, document_root. And this is the variable that basically just pre-fills the address for the web server from the root of the actual file system that the files are located in the server, all the way up to whatever the web root is based on, what PHP already kind of knows. So this is all kind of system-level PHP stuff. You can see more documentation as to the other things that _server can account for. So plenty of resources on PHP's own website, for example, if you wanted to do that. So basically, this part has given us the first section of our path. And the second part of our path is we need to just go from the web root to the actual file itself. So what we're going to do from there is we're just going to concatenate, which in PHP you do with a dot. And then we're also going to, give us some more quotes. And then I'll once again provide a root relative link or path to the file. So once again, training section /header.inc. Once that's all done, end with a semicolon, give it a space, question mark greater than, and now we have a PHP command inside of our page. So this is all done. I think that I wrote everything right. I'm always curious about the slash. Sometimes I forget the difference between adding it and not, so we'll see. But we're just going to go ahead and save. First thing you might notice, it's not showing up on the staging server. We'll get back to this, but like I said, all of this is happening on the server side, so OU Campus doesn't necessarily know and can't necessarily execute that server-side script for us. So for right now, it's not going to show us anything. But if we go ahead and publish this page out and view that in a new window, we can now see, ta-da, we have this back. Our header is still showing up even though the page itself does not have the HTML for my header. And if I viewed the source of this, we can once again confirm there's our header information showing up right here. The indentation's a little weird, but end of the day, it's all showing up here nicely. Now, let's go ahead and do one other thing really quick. I said that the file extension doesn't matter for the include file that you're bringing in. Let's put that to the test. We've got header.inc right here. Let's just rename this to header.brandon. I don't think that anyone has made a .brandon file extension. If so, they should get at me. I'd like to potentially buy some rights and interest into that. But we'll just call it header.brandon for right now. So performing this rename will actually cause this include file to get republished, as we can see down here. That's great. And now if I go ahead and refresh my page and I hit refresh, it's not showing up again. And the reason for that is our original page is still trying to look for header.inc. Header.inc no longer exists. Now it's header.brandon, which in my opinion is far preferable. So all we need to do is go back to our original page, and now instead of header.inc, let's call it header.brandon. Same thing, save, doesn't show up on staging yet. As soon as we go ahead and hit publish, Now if I go back to my live page and hit refresh, now we're back. So once again, file extension does not matter. Use whatever works for you. Y'all are existing customers, so it's probably going to be set up to be .inc unless, perhaps we've been instructed otherwise. All the stuff that I've talked about with htaccess and everything like this was something as I was learning about it, it tripped me up, so I thought I'd kind of pass on this knowledge to you guys. All of the stuff that I talked about in the PowerPoint, talking about enabling, parsing on the state production server and htaccess and all that stuff, that is only talking about your page itself. Basically, modifying htaccess to allow .html files to execute server-side includes doesn't contain any sort of information as to what the server-side include looks like or what file extension the include itself is. It's all just a matter of what documents can actually perform those operations. And in this case, we want to make sure that our web page file extensions can perform the necessary operations. So just a quick little bit of clarification. It took me a little bit. I got tripped up on the difference between what those htaccess settings were doing. So I figured I'd take that information there. We actually have a question. Joshua Lyons, what happens if you don't use a file extension? You know what? That's a great question, Josh. I've never tried it. Let's try it. So let's just go ahead and call this thing header, no file extension. My intuition tells me that it might break, but let's go ahead and see. So my new extension of nothing is different than Brandon. Yes, it is. All right, so we've got a file called header. And you can see that if I go to it, it's still just a, OU Campus is still treating this file as text, even though it doesn't have an extension. So let's just really quickly go back into here and say source. And if I go back to here and just get rid of header.brandon, save it, publish it out, I'm actually thinking it might work. Let's see. Yep, still works. I just hit refresh, so I'll just do it again. Everything's working out pretty good. So there's our answer, Joshua. It will actually work, even if you don't use a file extension, at least in the environment that I've got set up here. As always, I got to kind of put in the caveat of your results may vary. Everybody's production server and their environments might be a little differently, but at least in this case, we can see that it's not causing any problems. So at this point, let me just go ahead and change this back to something a little bit more sane. We'll use .inc from here on out. So .inc, I hit refresh, it's not there because I got to go ahead and just rename my include file itself. Alrighty, cool. So now let's go ahead and address the issue of why the include doesn't show up when we're previewing the page on staging. So what OU Campus has inside of it is kind of a way to get around this. Like I said, production server performing all of the inclusion parts. So of course the staging server can't really grab that data. The staging server is just a simulation. It's not a full, the preview here is not like a full web server that can actually execute server-side scripts. So here's how we can get around that. We can actually kind of do like a quasi-inclusion on the staging server that works in tandem with the inclusion that's happening on the production server. So if I go into the source, what I can do is right up above my PHP script, I'm going to actually denote an editable region. So I'm going to go ahead and just do OUC. Oh, actually, I'm on a normal HTML page, so I can't use the OUC node style format. I would have to put it into an HTML comment so the system can still utilize it. So you guys, if you're trying to play around with this on the staging server, you might actually be able to do the node style, but just in this example, we'll make it HTML comments. OUC:div. And just like every editable region notation, we have to give it a unique label to indicate what editable region or what region this is. So we'll just give it a label of header. And then what you can do is you can use the path attribute. And the path attribute essentially tells OU Campus, hey, don't grab the content inside of this editable region from whatever is encapsulated inside of it, grab it from a different source. Sounds a lot like an include actually, huh? So what we can do with this is I can actually just put in a root relative path, training dash section slash header dot inc, and then I will just close my opening tag and put in my secondary comment just to close my editable region, just like so. And now by doing so, if I hit save, look at that. It now shows up on the staging server. So just a recap for what just happened. Basically, by putting in this OUC div and adding this path attribute, we are saying, hey, OU Campus, don't look at whatever's in here. This stuff doesn't matter. What I want you to do is I actually want you to grab content from this file right here and display that as text on the staging server. And because the source file is just simply text, and now we're kind of quasi-including it on the staging server, all of this gets added on the staging. Now here's where it kind of gets cool. As you know, we don't, when we publish OU Campus files, we don't keep these OUC div tags. So basically, because this path attribute is an attribute inside of the div tag, once we publish, all of this stuff effectively gets wiped. And you are left with your PHP command, which, as we've already seen, is what actually works on the production server. So effectively, that's what we've just done right here. Now here's where it also gets cool. Because this path attribute is kind of its own separate declaration from what you're including here, technically, you don't actually have to have this point to the same file. So really quickly, let's just kind of put this to the test. Let's see, yeah, let's just save. So I'm going to go back here, and I'm going to copy header.inc, and we'll just copy it like so. And now I have header-1. And let's just, instead of header-1, let's call it header-fun.inc. And inside of header-fun.inc, I'm going to go in here and provide some additional information. I'm going to go ahead and put in a p tag that says Brandon was here. And now I'm going to hit save. So now we've got one header that looks different than the other. What I can do is I can go ahead and publish this out. Honestly, since the inclusion is happening on staging at this point, when we're going to be changing the path attribute, technically I don't even think I need to publish this, but just for the heck of it, I'm going to. So now we've got two different copies of the header, and I can go into the source code editor, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, when you're on staging, grab data from grab the data from header-fun, but when I publish, still grab the real header.inc. So when we hit save, now we can see that there is my extra information on the staging server. But once we go ahead and click that magical publish button and we go back to our live page, we don't see it over here. And that's because on the production server, it's grabbing from the real header.inc as opposed to the other one. And hypothetically, just to kind of beat this example to death, we could grab the same thing and do the opposite. So now things show up nicely on staging. And on the production server, now we get our other information. So that's kind of the basics for how we get around the server-side include issue in OU Campus. We just basically do this to allow it to show up on the staging server as well. And that's what you guys are all doing because, of course, when you guys go and edit your standard pages, and even if I go to a standard page here, right, you know, in this example, that's why we're able to get all of this type of stuff showing up on staging, even though it's all being brought in using server-side includes. So you might be wondering at this point, how are we actually doing that? Because of course, if I go to the source code of a standard PCF file, for example, you know, I don't see any sort of OUC divs that are pulling in from a different path. We don't see any of that other sort of information. You know, where's that stuff happening? So Now we get to kind of go into the, hey, we made this easier. What I just did is I basically kind of showed you the harder method because I had to actually manually type out my include command right in here, and I had to, provide other sorts of information, all of that sort of stuff. So when you're in a full-fledged implementation of OU Campus, we actually have written commands and functions that are going to essentially do all of this part for you. And instead of having it pull from two different include files, they're going to pull from the same one automatically. So let's take a look at how that works. And that'll probably bring us to the end of today, just to kind of give you a quick little orientation. For the most part, this will probably work the same for all of you guys too. There may be slight differences in how things work depending on how long you've been a customer and when you were implemented and things like that, and how much you've played around on your own. But this will give you kind of a boilerplate understanding. So when you're inside _resources, you can hop over to XSL, and most of you should have a folder called shared or similar. And when you go to shared, there's going to be a folder called function, or a file here called functions.xsl. If you go to functions.xsl, you'll notice that we have actually got, right up here at the top, we've got some functions that we have written in OU Campus to perform all of that server-side include stuff for you. So you can see here that we have a function that we've called OU include file. And basically, the only thing that that function accepts is a file path right there. There's also other options for this function. So if I provide just a single, value inside of the function, it'll use this copy of the function. If I provide 2, it'll provide this one, and if I provide 3, it'll give me this one. So it's just kind of different iterations of the same function. But basically, all it does is it accepts the full file path to wherever our include file is, and then it's going to essentially use another function called OU include. So let's just scroll down here and see what that one does. So a function called OU include, and also, you probably will have some information as to how this stuff is working in your implementation as well. So if you go to your own copy of functions.xsl, you'll probably be able to read some of these comments to tell you a little bit more about how things are working. But essentially, here's what's happening. XSL function called OU include, it accepts whatever your full file path is, and it also is going to grab a label. Now, why would we need a label? Well, if we remember, going back to the OUC div, every OUC div needs a unique label. So that's why we need to provide that information when performing this function. And then when we go down here, we have essentially the XSL version of what I just wrote out on my header testing file. So what I'm going to do, let me just really quickly grab that and put it right next to each other in the same file so we can kind of see the differences. Now, this will also, I guess, serve a little bit as a kind of an introduction or a refresher course as to kind of how XSL works. So for those of you who wanted to know more about XSL in Training Tuesdays, this isn't the full thing, but, it gives you a little bit of a taste of it. So I'm basically just going to comment or copy whatever I wrote right here, and I'm going to lay that down right next to what we have in the XSL file, so we can kind of just visually understand how these are working. So the function is going to grab your full path, and it's going to grab a label. So those are the two pieces of information that you were providing to this chunk of code in the XSL. And then it's going to take those and do some things with it. XSL comment, if you're not familiar what that does, is it creates a comment tag in HTML. So this will actually generate, a comment, an opening comment tag. So that's what XSL comment is going to do. And then it's going to say OUC div button text equals the value of whatever the button text could be. So if I wanted to, that would create something that looks like this. Button text equals, and then, something in here. And then the next thing it's going to do is it's going to provide the group attribute. That's another kind of default thing that every OUC div tag typically needs. So that would generate group equals, and then this label is probably just going to inherit from whatever else has been provided onto that page or applied to that directory. So we could just do group equals everyone, for example. And then eventually we get the label, and the label is going to be just grabbing the label. So we've already got that one written out. And then what really matters is that it's going to pass in the path attribute, which is what we have just right down there. And XSL value of select, what a value of does is it's just going to take the text value for whatever whatever it finds at where you're telling it to go. And we're telling it to just grab whatever the full path was that we provided. So it's just going to grab the text value of that, and it's going to place that right here. So essentially what this function is going to do is you're going to tell it to, hey, OU include file path. And so it's going to grab OU include and then grab my file path and place it inside of the div. And then it's going to do my ending XSL comments, which will give us just this right here. So basically, all of this stuff right here gives us what we see on line 61 inside of our actual PCF files. And then the next thing it's going to do is it's going to grab the copy of another function called OU SSI. As we remember, SSI stands for server-side include, and it's going to pass through that same full path. So this is how we guarantee that whatever path I have in the div is going to be the same that lives inside of my PHP include, because it's grabbing from the same source. So we can guarantee that those are going to be the same information. So, and then really, once we do the copy of select, I'll talk about this in a second, it's going to then just output an XSL comment, hey, just like this, end the OUC div tag, and then close the comment. So line 59 directly correlates to what we see on line 63. So really, OU SSI, this is where the meat and potatoes happen, because OU SSI is the function that actually gives us our PHP command, so the server-side include doesn't just look pretty in OU Campus, it actually does something on the live site. And OU SSI is very simple. Basically, what it does is it takes that same full path value that we've been passing through all three of these functions, XSL processing instruction with a name of PHP. This tag right here is what actually generates our opening PHP tag on the page. And then we are just writing include server document root. Oh, technically, I guess you're supposed to put in a space between these dots. See, I knew there was something syntactically that I probably wasn't doing exactly right. Thank goodness it didn't break. But in any case, it's giving us our concatenation. It's starting out the quotes again. And then it's just going to grab that full path and pass it into what we have right here, which, as we remember, is going to be the exact same as what's being passed through right there, too. And with that, it's going to just give us our question mark and then end the processing instruction for PHP, which will effectively close the tag. Oh, and also don't forget the semicolon. So essentially what you do, if we take all of these functions together, what you can basically do is here, let me just get rid of this. We don't actually want this in our XSL. I can basically go in here, and I'm just going to put it right underneath the bottom of this. I can basically say $OU include file. Actually, I think it's a lowercase I. Let me just confirm that. Yep. So we're going to essentially declare our first function, OU include file. Oh, scroll too far. And then because it's a function, I'm just going to put in parentheses, and I would provide whatever my full path was going to be. So in this case, I could do something like /training section /header .inc. And basically all I need to provide. So OU include file, this and this. What that's going to do is it's going to grab this data, and it's going to plug it in to the OU include function. So what it's really going to do next is it's going to say OU include, and it's going to give me this, just like so, and it's actually going to paste that same information once more again right afterwards, because if you remember, OU include requires 2 parameters, so 2 values that we need to pass through, the full path again, and then the label. So essentially this on line 74 turns into line 75, and then line 76 is what our next result is going to be. Well, technically line 75, once you perform this, it's going to give us OUC div button text equals, basically it's just going to pass through this like several times over, I believe. And then once you kind of get through from all of this, what really matters after all of this is done, I'll just put some ellipses, is we're going to do path equals, and then we're going to provide that. And then it's going to essentially grab in the server-side include, which is going to give us our processing instructions, blah, 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 blah. I think that you guys hopefully, I think you guys get it at this point. And then we essentially just close out the comment. So this is a very short way of typing all of this and having OU Campus do the same thing. So with that, that's kind of what we're doing in OU Campus to make that process easier. And if you look into the XSL, you can kind of see how this, see many situations in which this is happening. Erica tells me that she's got a couple questions for me, so I'll go ahead and answer those. And then we'll just wrap up with seeing where this OU include file, let's go ahead and just kind of see where that's actually being used in our actual XSL. So Erica, go for it.
So I have a couple questions from Raid Shahada, and the first one is, if you have one common.xsl that includes the call of header.inc and you have home.xsl and college.xsl, and you want to use a different header with the same common.xsl file instead of duplicating it, and I'm assuming they're asking how would you then set that up?
That's going to kind of factor into something in XSL called import precedence. So let me see if I can, I don't know if necessarily this XSL is going to give me a great example of it, but we're going to go ahead and give it a try. That might actually be something that I could segue into with what I was about to talk about. So if there's another question that might be more easily answered right now, go ahead and ask that one too. Or was that basically it?
And then the other question is also from Raid, if you have ASPS/IIS, how can you rewrite including the OUSSI?
That's something that I'm a little bit less familiar with. My limited experience is kind of just to the Apache and PHP environments. I'm a little more familiar with like the syntax and everything for that. If you do have other questions about this, one resource that's always available is our support team. If you want to email us at support@omniupdate.com with any questions that I'm not able to answer here on the call, that we can at the very least point you in the direction of some appropriate resources. We can, kind of dive deeper into the question, and then, if it is something that's OU Campus specific, like how a function's working or something along those lines, kind of like the first question, that would be like an OU Campus thing since it deals with XSL. We can actually even kind of walk you through it step by step. So that might be a situation where a support team could kind of have a bit, like a more robust dialogue with you, I suppose. That's something that just right here live, I would have to do a little bit of research to get the answer to you there. But thank you for the question, and like I said, support@omniupdate.com. We're always willing to help out and answer any questions you guys have on this stuff. Alrighty, are there any other questions before I move on, Erica?
I'm not seeing any come in, and I do want to remind people, if you're using chat to ask a question, you can select who you're sending it to at the bottom of that little window. Please make sure you choose presenter, if you want the person, who's actually doing the presentation to see it. Otherwise, it's just me, and then I have to sort of hold on to it. So there's a good chance to bring it up in conversation. So again, please address questions to the presenter, not the host.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
And what's even better is using the Q&A window, because the Q&A window will come to both of us, and that sometimes is a little bit easier. I have both Q&A and chat open on my side, so as long as the question ends up showing up in my little view, I'll be able to kind of call it out and answer it. But thanks for the reminder, Erica. Okay, so let's hop into kind of like a common example for where this is working, and I'll just go through I'll use the header example as one possible use case. So basically, if I hop out of this functions.xsl, which is basically just like a repository for all the functions that we could possibly ever want to use, if I hop into my common XSL, as a reminder, common XSL is kind of just the standard stuff that's going to be added to every single page on my site, we can actually just kind of start scrolling through here and see if we can find that function a couple times. So what we might do is if I go into my body, I can see here that there is a template called header, and if I kind of scroll further down, there it is. So it's going to give us a header tag in HTML, and then if we kind of scroll past this emergency notification, we've got one of our first examples of the include file function being utilized. So we have a div called search bar, and then we're performing an XSL copy of, which is just going to grab the data from a specific source. And inside of the select attribute, we're actually performing our include file function. So what this is doing right here is it's telling OU Campus to, hey, go ahead and grab the include file that lives here, display the information inside of an OUC div node on the staging server, so it actually shows up when we're previewing, and also perform a PHP include to grab that information and actually, have it show up on the production server. And you can see that we're doing this quite a few times. We're grabbing, another include file for the logo in my header. And if I were to go to like a normal page here, whoops. What? Okay, well, that's strange. I don't know what's going on with that. We would see the header showing up, some top navigation, all this sort of stuff, and it's inside of common.xsl. So we can see that we're using OU include file quite a few times. If I highlight this, you can also see the system's going to actually underline wherever else that function appears. And we can also see that there's a couple places where we're not doing the full kind of 3-function chain. We're just doing OU SSI immediately. And usually we are wrapping that inside of a little test here that just says only use that OU SSI function when we're actually publishing the page, which would essentially mean that the include wouldn't try to be replicated on the production server. But anyways, so we can see many examples of how this is being utilized. If you look into your own common.xsl or even your specific templates, you're going to see that OU include file function being utilized quite a bit. And every time you see that function, you can think back about what we learned today and say, hey, I know exactly what that thing is doing and why it's actually letting me see stuff on my staging server and my production server. But going into Raid's question, basically, if you're in a situation where perhaps I have different logos for different sections of my site, for example, I would have kind of my default logo probably living inside of common.xsl, because every page is importing common.xsl in its XSL importing situation, because it's kind of like all of our fallback default stuff. But if I wanted to have a different include file with a different logo used for a specific one of my page templates, for example, what I would essentially do is I would probably copy, kind of the surrounding HTML that performs that include. I'll just do this as a quick example, even though this isn't the full this isn't my full header, but it would kind of drive the point across. I would grab that, and what I would do is I would probably go into one of my more specific XSL files. So common.xsl is being used everywhere, but it's not being directly referenced by your PCF pages. Your PCF pages are directly referencing things like home.xsl or interior.xsl. And so what you would do is in interior.xsl, you would probably go in here and you would recreate your XSL template name. So XSL template name of header was the one that contained all of the information that I just copied. And then I would just essentially go in here and then just change my logo to logo admissions or something like that. And then with the way XSL determines precedence, essentially because the PCFs are referencing interior.xsl first before they actually import common in, it's going to be able to see this and say, okay, well, this takes precedence over the generic template of header that we have in common.xsl. So that's basically what you would do. It's really not at that point much of a, it's not really much of like a which include wins out over the other question. It's actually which XSL file gets, is given more priority. If there are two templates in two XSL files that have the same name, which one of those wins out? Basically, whatever XSL file is more specific is going to win. And in that case, whatever is contained within that template, you could have a reference to a specific or different include file as opposed to the generic one. So without, looking at the exact code of what you're talking about, that would probably be my guess as to what you would probably do. You would just have a template name of header that would contain that specific information. There's probably a cleaner way to import that. So maybe you would have a sub-template just called header logo and only have the header logo kind of be the thing that changes from specific to general and then keep everything else isolated in common.xsl. But that's pretty much what you would do. So hopefully that answers your question. That would probably be what I would say to do there. And with that, just in the interest of time, I feel like that's probably enough to kind of get you guys as excited about includes. Obviously, there's a ton more things that you can do with these. I didn't talk about some of the other cool things like you can do, but to a certain degree, it does, kind of get things started there. Are there any other questions that people have about include files or how we're using them in OU Campus or anything like that?
I'm not seeing any questions. There was a brief raised hand from George Sackett, but I think.
Yeah, I saw that too. Yeah, George, if you do have a question, hit us up in the Q&A box there. While we wait for any other last-minute questions to potentially come through, just wanted to give you guys an announcement of next month's Training Tuesday. It's going to be, like always, last Tuesday of the month. This September, it's going to be September 26th. And we're going to have Brian Laird, one of the developers in professional services, coming in to talk about Site Clone. So that should be pretty exciting. Stay tuned for more details, and as always, for the registration link coming through to your inboxes via the OCN.
And the recording of this Training Tuesday will be available on the support site as well. Check back later today, and it should be up. If not, it will definitely be up by tomorrow.
Cool beans. All right, folks. Well, thank you so much for listening to me talk about includes and throw in a couple bad jokes on the side. I hope you guys learned a lot, and I hope it kind of just taught you a little bit more about a common web technology that's becoming more and more prevalent as time goes on, and also understanding how we in OU Campus are making that easier for you guys. So thanks a lot, and we'll see you next month.